Jesus freak here, and I guess the question is inevitable, but the fact of the matter is, I'm pretty much self taught. Although my two uncles, my father's younger brothers, were both eventually preachers, they were in training at the time I knew them. I didn't really learn anything from them. Such as it was, a lot of what I know or claim to know either comes from the Bible directly or from various study resources I've found. And like, I used to tear through everything at the Lewiston Public Library. It's next town over, but that's where I lived at the time. And a lot of my early research was a matter of my one uncle had the first New Revised Standard Version edition of the New Oxford Annotated Bible. I have the later edition, which is the third edition, because the first edition was RSV, the original Revised Standard. So as far as, credentials go, I don't have any. Completely self-taught. Now, this also is the reason why some of the things I believe differently than others. Regardless of what, so and so says this and so says that. Well, I don't care what so and so says unless he can back it up. And there's only one way you can back it up. You know the phrase, quote me chapter and verse. Well, there's a reason that phrase exists. Now, I had made a couple attempts at trying to do my own translation of the Bible just to see if I could. Starting back in 1999, it's about 20 years now. And initially, these ideas fell apart. But when in 2002, I obtained a dump of a database containing the Geneva Bible of 1587 edition in its entirety. And sometime after that, I found a dump of the King James Version in a 1611 form. And around 2006 or 2007, I had managed to acquire myself a PDF of the first edition of the New Testament that Erasmus published in 1516. It was at that point, convinced by one of my friends, I decided this was the approach I needed to take. And this was how I was going to be able to do it. It took me about 5 years. I finished in 2012. I kind of worked on it out of order. I was working on the Gospels. I worked through the Catholic epistles, went back and worked on Paul's out of order. I think I started with First Corinthians, went onward, skipped Romans, saved that for the end, and then the last two books I did were Romans and Acts. And even so, with the Gospels, I went John. I think I went John, Mark, Matthew, Luke. I might have gone John, Matthew, Mark, Luke. But I know I started with John. Now, with the resources that I was able to obtain that late in the game, I produced what I thought was a reasonably competent translation. And it changed my mind about a lot of things. I wanted to have it done for May 2011. I completely blew that. It took a little over a year longer than I wanted. May 2011 would have been symbolic and would have stood for 400 years since the King James. But it wasn't until 2012 that I finally finished. And over time, I admitted, it's got faults. But it actually led to the exact opposite of what I was hoping for. Now, I admit, I don't speak a word of Greek. I was working from Latin. Still, what I eventually concluded was most of my qualms against the King James were unfounded. There were issues, sure. There's things I don't agree with the way the King James translated. But in the end, I had a newfound respect for the translators. Now, 2011, I also moved back into the city after kind of disappearing off the face of the earth for a few months. And not too long after this, I had a run-in with a couple Mormons. And the Mormons spent several months trying to convert me without success. Now, at the time, I was down to 2 Bibles. One was my New Oxford Annotated Bible that I mentioned earlier. The other was a New King James El Cheapo bonded leather, verse by verse. And it was this that I had with me. Now, I was talking with the Mormons about this and that. And it had been King James Onlyists who had driven me to do my own translation. But realizing at this point, because of the Mormons, that if I was dealing with King James Onlyists, the only way I could deal with them was with the King James. I started to make a change of tactic. Where prior to that I had been mostly using the New Revised Standard, and I had made some pretty heavy use of my own translation, I started to more exclusively use the King James, not out of preference, but out of a desire to avoid offense. This is also when I started to stock up on Bibles, and these would be King James Bibles. And this is where I adopted my attitude that anything you need to do, you can do with a King James. It wasn't a matter of, oh, I prefer these manuscripts over these. To be fair, I mostly do. I personally felt that, the scholarship behind Nestle Aland was faulty. That they were proceeding from invalid premises. Somewhat more valid premise, I guess, would yield your Robinson Pierpont text, or Hodges Farstad, which is the majority text that the New King James references. And I started to do more research in other areas. I remembered how, when my church, back around 1990, started modernizing their liturgy, and a lot of people threw a hairy conniption fit. They didn't like, for example, it changed the Sursum Corda, which used to go, the Lord be with you and with thy spirit. Lift up your hearts. We lift them up to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It's meet and right so to do, etc., etc. And it changed the wording to, oh, the Lord be with you and also with you. Lift up your hearts. We lift them up to the Lord. Let us give thanks to the Lord our God. It is right to give our thanks and praise. And some of us balked. This is, I guess, the liturgical counterpart of people balking at the Revised Standard Version back in the 1950s. And it was over a lot of research, meditation, etc., that I decided to take a traditionalist approach on things. And I admit that this leads me in a different direction than maybe you'd expect. Now, despite me saying, I have some respect for tradition beyond my own traditions. I mentioned in an earlier version I had this approach of prima scriptura, which means I'm not discounting tradition altogether. I just believe that where it conflicts with scripture, then the tradition has to go in a wood chipper. But that's a whole nother matter. There's some people that are so iconoclastic that throw out tradition altogether. That's your preference. I don't have a problem with that. That's your prerogative. Tradition in and of itself means nothing. And that's where I say prima scriptura, because I do consult tradition rather than saying, oh, the scripture is the be all and end all. I'm like, the scripture is the be all and end all so far as it actually says anything. And where it doesn't make any pronouncements, I might rely on tradition or not. That's what I mean when I say prima scriptura. This, despite coming from a tradition where tradition, reason, and experience are put on the same pedestal as the Bible. And I don't do that. And it's funny, I guess, I was raised in the United Methodist Church. I'm still in the United Methodist Church. But I openly disagree with them on several things. And I've always been more evangelical than most people I've known in the United Methodist Church. Because, I read the Bible, I made my own conclusions. And my conclusions came from the clear and plain words of Holy Writ. Not from, oh, so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that, or this is what we've always believed. I don't care what you've always believed. What's the Bible say? That's always been my attitude. Jesus freak out.